Africa's lack of infrastructure and industrial development left them susceptible to pandemics like AIDS, and now we have the Ebola crisis. Some say polio was eradicated by vaccines. Others say it was because of the advent of sanitation, plumbing in Appalachia, and the rural South, but either way it was due to scientific progress. Today we need Dr. Webster Tarpley to help us grasp what is going on with this current pandemic, with an emphasis on the economics of Ebola. Given the symptoms, this could be reminiscent of the Black Plague. Hello, Webster.
How you doing, Daniela?
Good.
Good to be with you.
So this is this reminiscent of the Black Plague to you?
Anytime there's an epidemic that threatens to become a pandemic, right, a worldwide epidemic, then we have to begin to think about historical models, what history can teach. Now, you know, I'm Dr. Tarpley here. I'm not a doctor of medicine. I'm a doctor of history, and maybe under certain circumstances, this can teach us more. And we have a tradition to draw on that goes back in the Western world to the 1340s. And it was in the 1340s that this pandemic called the Black Plague began to come into Southern Europe, the Mediterranean ports, coming from the Levant, right, coming from the Eastern Mediterranean and coming from further in the Far East. And you have to also bear in mind that in order to have a pandemic, it really takes two ingredients, as I see it anyway. One is you have to have the contagion, right? You have to have the virus or the bacterium or whatever it is. On the other hand, you've got to have conditions, and the conditions can be situations of bad sanitation, no water available, no sewage drainage, no adequate systems in that regard. And then you've also got to look at the nutrition. You've got to look at the physical state of human subjects involved. And I can say that in the 1340s, right, the thing that we see in the 1300s as they go along is the effects of an austerity policy. It is the domination of the Mediterranean basin by Venetian and Genoese bankers and the kinds of usury that they impose on the rulers, the kings or princes, other potentates, which requires then an increased pressure on sharecroppers and on farmers and others, leaving them with less and less of their food crops to devote to nutrition and more of it being sold off elsewhere as a cash crop. So generally speaking, I would say after 20 years of globalization, which is a form of austerity, it's a kind of international monetary fund shock therapy for the world, the vulnerability of humanity to new pandemic diseases is large. I don't know how large. It's very difficult to get statistics. We can simply estimate that in the United States, right, we've had several years now of austerity. If you look at Southern Europe, you certainly have to say that Portugal, Spain, Greece, Ireland, Italy, some other places, these places have undergone brutal austerity, and their vulnerability to pandemics is increasing. And that certainly includes war zones. Imagine what Syria is like today. Imagine what Iraq is like. Imagine what Lebanon is like as a result of these austerity policies. So we've got, I think, a very, very dangerous mix. The specific thing that we learned from the response to the Black Death of the 1340s is that you can fight it with quarantine. And this word quarantine is actually etymologically interesting in itself. It means the quaranta is 40, right? So it's the idea was if you were going to come into Venice in particular, they had a special island set apart where they had a kind of you could call it a large hotel, although it was certainly not very luxurious. And it was divided into many, many, many small cubicles. Each one could accommodate a person or a small family or something like this. And the idea was if you came into the port of Venice on a boat that came from an area where the plague had been reported by the network of Venetian ambassadors and diplomatic representatives, then you were told, sorry, you've got to go to this quarantine, and you're going to have to spend 40 days and 40 nights sitting there to make sure that you're not a healthy carrier of some terrible disease. And the legend goes that emerged before Venice. It emerged in the Adriatic city of Ragusa, right? It's Dubrovnik, Yugoslavia these days, but under the Venetians, Ragusa. And that they instituted a 40-day quarantine in order to protect themselves against the Black Death. What I would like to talk about primarily is policy, okay? What should be done? Not commentary, not complaining, not, anti-government or pro-government ideology for that matter, but what would really be effective at this point? And I would have to start with my overall evaluation of the U.S. health system is not as optimistic as some that we've been hearing in the mass media these days. For example, we have this guy, Anthony Fauci, is someone who has done yeoman service at the National Institutes of Health, not far from me here in Bethesda. He's down the road from where I am, but he's sitting in Bethesda at the NIH, and he has said that the principal reason we can be confident that Ebola will not become an epidemic in the United States is because our healthcare system is so much better than the one in West Africa, right? In countries like Liberia or Sierra Leone or some others where this disease has broken out. And I would say yes and no. In other words, up to a point, the U.S. healthcare system strikes me as a very capable one, but with no depth. In other words, it has excellent quality facilities, but it does not have enough of them. It has no logistical depth. It is susceptible to being overwhelmed.
You meaning we don't have enough hospitals?
That's right. We don't have enough hospitals. We don't have enough hospital beds. And I want to really talk about that in detail, because in the debate over Obamacare, we heard this constant line, the U.S. healthcare system is better than anybody else in the world. It's true if you've got money, if you've got coverage, and as long as there are not too many people demanding it. I would say it's a high-quality system, but brittle. Once it's broken through, it's going to be in big trouble. It can be overwhelmed, and it might easily be overwhelmed, and I think we should bear that in mind. It's a little bit like the U.S. military right now, right? You say the U.S. military is a very capable colonial army, capable of defeating most adversaries, but if you came across a very determined adversary that had some numerical and logistical and strategic depth, something like Russia or China, then it would not be such a great military. And I'm afraid we've gotten into that.
Yeah, we have less people in our military.
We have a situation here where the thing could be overwhelmed by numbers, and it's a result of austerity policies. And I think we can show this. Let's start with the most obvious thing. If you want to have a public health emergency, you've got to ask yourself, how much hospital capacity do you have in relation to your population, right? You've got to be able to put people, in this case, not only into a hospital with Ebola, you've got to put them into special kinds of isolation, right? You've got to have a chamber where the air pressure inside the chamber is lower than outside so that the air comes in but doesn't go out. You understand, right? All these different things. People have to have special hazardous materials, gear, and so forth. So let's look at a study by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, right? The OECD studies economic trends. And they did, a couple of years ago, they did a study. Actually, this is even more recent. It's a couple of months ago. It's basically right up to date. They compared a number of countries, 40 countries or so, concerning their availability of hospital beds. And the way this is measured is hospital beds per 1,000 people, right? So you put everybody on the same kind of measure. I'm going to go through this list, and I think you're going to be very surprised, and you're going to have to wait a while before the United States appears on the list, practically at the tail end.
Wow.
And you're going to be amazed, I think, by who's ahead of the United States in terms of hospital beds per person. Now, this is not a qualitative measure. It's quantitative, but this can be very important in a situation where you may have high numbers of victims. Let's start The champion, as far as the OECD is concerned, is Japan. And Japan has 13.4 beds per 1,000 population.
Okay.
Second on the ranking is South Korea. They have 9.56 beds per 1,000 population. You're going to be surprised at how well Russia does. Russia does 9.37 beds per 1,000 population. And again, it's not the quality, but the quantity, and this is one way that we can compare. Let's go to Europe now with the count. The best in Europe is Germany, right? Federal Republic of Germany, 8.27 beds per 1,000 people. Mm-hmm. Then we go to the Republic of Austria, 7.65 beds per 1,000 people. And then we find some interesting cases, right? Ones that I think you're going to be surprised by. Hungary, 7.17 beds per 1,000. Still no U.S., you notice? Mm-hmm. U.S. has not come up. Czech Republic, 6.84 beds per 1,000 people. Poland, 6.55 beds per 1,000. France, 6.37 beds per 1,000. Belgium, 6.35 beds per 1,000. And there's a gap, and you'll see that the United States comes in at about half, less than half, the capacity of France and Belgium and Poland. The United States clocks in at 3.05 beds per 1,000 population. And that puts the U.S. not exactly last, but very close to last. The places that are in the OECD study that turn out to be worse than the United States are Ireland, 2.96, and then, as usual, the all-time negative champion, right, the absolute, dregs of the situation, United Kingdom, which comes in at 2.95 beds per 1,000 people. But we are so close. The United States is so close to Great Britain that we're practically in the same boat. And what it shows you, among other things, is that the Anglo-Saxon model of free trade economics, once again, is a disaster from every point of view. And now we can add in this point of view of, do you want to survive? If you get sick, do you want to have some hope that there's a hospital bed for you? Now,
and what would we suggest would be optimal? Something like Japan's numbers?
Well, obviously, as much as you can get. Yeah. But let's look at the U.S. history of it, because the U.S. was never great, but the U.S. has been much better. The U.S. has been in the past about 50% better before the era of free trade, free market, laissez-faire, monetarism, neoliberalism, and all that, right? Coming in, that came in the 1970s. Now let's look at this historically in the U.S. After World War II, in 1945 and 1946, there was an attempt to evaluate what had the war experience taught the U.S. about public health. And one of the things they found was that almost half the young men that were going to be drafted by the selective service system, about 40%, were unfit to serve, right? 4F was what they used to be called. 4F, you're off the hook. You can't serve. You're physically incapable of being a soldier, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm sure there was a humanitarian motive, but the actual operative motive was military, right? If you want to have an army in the Cold War, you're going to have to do something about this wretched performance, right? Where almost half of the young men are too mentally, physically usually, impaired in order to serve. So the Congress passed and President Truman signed something called the Hill-Burton Act, Hillburton. Hill was, interestingly, a Southern Democrat. This was Lister Hill, senator from Alabama. These were days when the Southern Democrats, they were for education and infrastructure, whatever other problems they had, and they had plenty, but at least they had some saving graces. So Lister Hill voted for this. And this is infrastructure, right? When you're talking hospitals, you're talking what is sometimes called soft infrastructure. It's not quite the same thing as an electricity grid or a canal system or a port, or railroad, but it's absolutely critical infrastructure. So the Hill-Burton Act said what? The Hill-Burton Act provided that the federal government would adopt a target of how many beds per person there ought to be in the United States. And their target was 4.5 beds per thousand population. In order to get back to, let's put it, if we wanted to get back to the Hill-Burton criterion, we'd have to have a 50% increase in what we've got. We'd have to have another 1.5 beds per thousand people across the United States to go from 3 to 4.5. So we've got from that point of view, we have a 50% deficit right now. We're 50% below where we said we wanted to be in 1946. Think of this.
Wow, all the way back to 1946. It's incredible.
70 years or almost, right? So this is a huge scandal. And the other thing about it is it's not a linear scandal. It goes something like this. The Hill-Burton Act kicked in 1946, and it meant the federal government would make available a certain amount of financing as direct grants, right? Not paid back, just money, a gift to certain localities that were at the top of the list in terms of need for medical facilities. So some of it was a direct grant from the United States Treasury to the hospital authorities of Alabama or wherever it was. Southern states obviously needed it more, but other states needed it too. So part of it was a direct gift, and then the federal government also provided guarantees on financing, a little bit like what the Export-Import Bank does for export loans. There was a Hill-Burton authority that went to work, and they would guarantee borrowing by local hospital authorities. And I can say here in Washington, if you go down behind the National Institutes of Health, there's one called Suburban Hospital. And you go into Suburban Hospital, and there's a plaque, and it says this building was constructed thanks to the Hill-Burton Act of 1946, and that's why there is that important hospital serving the northern suburbs of the northern part of Washington, D.C., and then the southern suburbs. So all of this building went on in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, into about 1975. By 1975, the target, and this is now, 30 years after the law was passed, by 1975, we had almost 4.5 beds per thousand. But at that point, guess what kicked in? Milton Friedman, von Hayek, von Mises, Thatcherism before the fact, avant la lettre, and right, the process of tearing down the wonderful structures of the New Deal. You can say that this Hill-Burton Act is one of the last features of the mature New Deal. The New Deal in the 1940s and 50s was still being completed, right, with important components, and this is certainly one of them. So what happened? You
remember when we were running Randy Credico for mayor, and they took down St. Vincent's Hospital and turned it into condominiums.
Right, so, or we had it here also in Washington, D.C., right? We had a wonderful hospital that served especially the black community and the poor black community. This was called D.C. General, District of Columbia General Hospital. It was over sort of on the east side of the district by the Anacostia River, and this was simply destroyed for precisely the same thing, for gentrification, for catering to rich parasites and their desires to have waterfront condominiums and things like this. And I would also point out the Washington Post and the Graham family were absolutely key up front in destroying this D.C. General. But this is a huge process. So you reach the target in 1975, and just about at that time, you get this looting of the accumulated wealth by privateers, right? Private predators, Wall Street parasites, and others. And the result of that is, over the 25 years, I guess, after 1975, the United States loses 1,000 hospitals. And as you say, loses about 1/3 of the existing hospital beds. But remember, the problem is you can lose 1/3, but to get back to where you were, you've got to gain half of where you are at the rock bottom. So think of that.
So we need 1,000
hospitals.
hospitals now or more because of the increase in population.
Yeah, we would need 1,000 large state-of-the-art hospitals in the United States. And I have to say, this has been part of my recovery program. If you go to tarpley.net and look at the top of the page, it says recovery program. It's a red box, right? You're going to get a PDF. And that PDF points to the need for 1,000 modern hospitals to be built in the United States just to get more or less to where you should have been in 1946, or based on the 1946 criteria. So I think you can see with this, right, the influence of ideology. Let's look at that, right? How did these 1,000 hospitals get destroyed? Well, part of it are these things like, Governor Scott of Florida, right, reactionary Republican predator. He's got this, Hospital Corporation of America, whatever they call it. What they would do is go and get public hospitals, community hospitals, and privatize them. They'd buy them up, and then they'd run them for profit. Other hospitals were driven out of existence. New York City in the 60s and 70s had an excellent system of community city hospitals that were quite good. Many of them have been taken down. So it's a process of asset stripping against the public good. In other words, the sweat and the labor of the American people made it possible to reach 4.5 beds per thousand in 1975. And no sooner did that happen, the counterattack of Friedman, von Hayek, von Mises, down with government, right? The libertarians, the myrmidons who want to destroy civilization, otherwise known as libertarians. They come in and say, no, this is all wrong. You're violating the free market, right? And the result is, how many deaths?
I don't know if anybody in the audience has been in a modern emergency room lately, but I ended up having to go to the emergency room for a minor abrasion. I was there for 16 hours, and I was told by a staff worker that on a daily basis, a couple of people a day die waiting to get into the emergency room.
Right, and then factor in what 1,000 additional emergency rooms, what that could do, right? That's exactly what you're going to need. So I think you're going to have to get back to this idea of a mosaic of public, that is to say, of city, county, state, some federal, certainly, and private. You're going to have a kind of a variegated system. But in terms of how you get there programmatically, I've already said my program is build 1,000 hospitals. Now, how do you do that? Do you borrow the money from China? Do you increase taxes? No, you don't do any of that. You essentially do two things. The parts that are outright grants come from taxing Wall Street. The lack of money, the fiscal crisis of American government at all levels has to do with the fact that Wall Street pays no taxes. They pay zero or even negative federal corporate income tax. That would be General Electric, which is now a bank. It's a hedge fund in drag, as some say. That's the money that is going to be granted. The Wall Street sales tax takes care of it, right? They pay 1% on all of their turnover. Whether they win or lose, 1% goes to the public treasury. And, of course, in that same campaign, you want to look into closing some of the loopholes of the federal corporate income tax. By the way, there's a huge campaign now to have tax reform, meaning lower the federal corporate income tax. No. They say the U.S. with 35% has the highest tax rate of corporate income tax, but nobody pays 35%. The U.S. corporate income tax actually paid is about 15%, and that is lower than other countries where it comes in at about 20%. So don't let yourself be kidded that somehow business is suffering or that Wall Street needs tax relief. No, they have to pay because these are the essential costs of civilization. I hope everybody can see that. Mm-hmm. If you don't have a hospital bed waiting for you when you get sick, then that is not civilization anymore. Then we've descended into barbary and chaos and what we don't want. Aren't you willing to tax Wall Street in order to avoid a situation where people are going to be dying in the streets? Because that's where all this stuff
dying
is.
Sitting in an emergency room waiting to see a doctor.
Yes, right. Just for image reasons, right? You're not going to die in the street. We have a room you can go to and die there, right? All right. So these are the dictates of humanity, right? Any religion you want, Christianity, Buddhism, the Sadaka of Judaism, Muslim social side, they all would say the people with these huge bank turnover, and I'm not even talking about individuals, I'm talking about the banks, they have to be taxed to make this up. The other side of it, of course, is the Federal Reserve System has to stop seeing itself as the servant of the banks only and see itself as the servant of the people and the national economy. And that's one of my other points, is that there has to be $5 trillion, a first tranche of 0% 100-year credit to rebuild all infrastructure. And that means roads, rails, ports, canals, electrical grids, you name it. But it emphatically includes hospitals, along with schools, universities, libraries, public buildings, and so forth. The kind of stuff that Works Progress Administration did with Harry Hopkins.
And in order to get them to change their perspective on this, we need to collectively demand that they do.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, do you want civilization? Yes or no? That's an interesting question. Or do you want to die? That's the most essential question in politics is, are you willing to fight so that you don't die? And I think it's pretty clear in this case that that's what's at stake. So,
well, that's being eroded when you have the right-wing alternative media and libertarians saying go back to living on your own land.
Yeah, nasty, brutish, and short, right?
Yeah.
But let's leave them aside, because there are other ingredients that we have to take into account that civilization is dictating to us, right? Mm-hmm. So we've got the hospitals are being rebuilt through a combination of Wall Street taxes that they cough up and 0% 100-year loans from the infrastructure window of the nationalized Federal Reserve, called it the Bank of the United States. Now you've got the problem, who's going to treat you? There is a shortage of about 250,000 doctors in the United States. This figure was developed during the Obamacare fight, several years ago. It's still there. I don't see it being addressed. We've got about 250,000 doctors that have to be trained now. They should be in school now. And the problem with this is you can't have these people crushed by the burden of medical school, right? We've got a situation now where it's a clear national necessity that if people are willing to go to a community college and a state university, there's got to be a path to a free college degree, BA, BS, you name it, right? You've got to get an associate's degree at your community college and then on to a bachelor's degree. And there's got to be a path for somebody who has basically no money to do that. So no tuition. And if you're going to get student loans, that's another window at the Federal Reserve. That's the student loan window. And that's 0% for 25, 30 years, whatever that might take. And then you've got medical school. You've got to really fight hard to get people into medical school. Because, again, otherwise, no matter what insurance you think you have, if there's no doctor, then that will not work. So
we need to consider this an infrastructure immediately.
We're talking soft infrastructure, right? Medical systems are soft infrastructure. Now, there's yet another element which kicks in when we come to something like Ebola. We have the precedent here in the United States of the Manhattan Project, right? It simply shows that the massive, generous, lavish commitment of resources, people, political support, money, and so forth between 1942 and 1945, this created nuclear energy as an atomic pile and also as then the atomic bomb. So it means that the most challenging scientific and engineering problems can be overwhelmed by a crash program. And that's what we would need for something like Ebola. Right? To the degree that Ebola threatens the world, there's got to be a massive counterattack on Ebola. You have to think in military terms. And that would mean a science driver that I've been trying to advocate for quite a number of years. I distinguish three science drivers. Let me just mention the other two. One science driver is high-energy physics. The most visible form of that is ITER program, right? The thermonuclear fusion reactor now being set up in the south of France. If that goes into break even and actual energy production, we're going to have a way out of the block universe of the Malthusians, because you'll have an energy source where the main raw material is seawater, and there's plenty of that. So that will get us into the clear for quite a few hundred years, I would say. So one of them is high energy physics. The other one is space exploration, colonization, industrial production, space under zero gravity, on the moon, Mars, places like this. That's two. But the third is the biomedical research. And here you can have more than one spearhead. AIDS is going to be a spearhead. The obvious things. Alzheimer's is probably going to be the most expensive disease coming up. Diabetes is very costly. On and on, right? Heart disease, obviously. And we can go through a list. I'm not trying to leave anybody out, but we don't have time to enumerate all of them. You could add Ebola to that list, right? And we have some promising beginnings. And how do you do that? Well, you're going to have the combination, in this case, primarily of money from the U.S. Treasury paid in there by Wall Street, the people that have been getting a free ride, the people who are to be paying us reparations for having saved their miserable counting houses back in 2008, and some of it also then from the 0% window at the Fed. Now, let's see where things have actually been going on that front. This, I think, is also quite interesting and quite shocking. You know, we just had these austerity battles, right? We had the Tea Party, right? We had Senator Ted Cruz, remember?
Mm-hmm.
So what did that look like? What did that do? I want people, to the extent that we have victims, right? We have people who die from this. I want people to remember who set up a situation where people were going to die. Irresponsible demagogues shooting their mouths off because of their own megalomaniac political ambitions, who took part in wrecking key functions of government. And I want to be very specific. We have the National Institutes of Health here in Bethesda, Maryland, right? The guy that I mentioned at the beginning. Anthony Fauci is the head of the allergies and infectious diseases part of that. He's been around since the AIDS scare crisis began back in the 1980s. And then a dependence of the NIH is the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. That's sort of the more operative, but the NIH is operative also. So right now, the head of the National Institutes of Health is Francis Collins, and this is a famous guy with some scientific merit. He was one side of the race in the 1990s to map the human genome, right? Francis Collins was mapping the human genome through the government agencies, and they made a lot of important progress. And then there was Craig Venter at Celera, very close to where I am now, and they did it in the private sector, right? So that was Celera, right? And somehow between the two, the genome was mapped in the first approximation, at least, by about 2000. They went and were received by Clinton. One of the interesting byproducts was Venter told Clinton, "We have found that there's no such thing as race." That's a very interesting finding. Republicans don't seem to agree with that down to the present day. But now, Collins is therefore not just some little jerk, right? He's somebody with a track record, pluses and minuses, but he's been fighting for scientific progress in his own way. Now, here's a statement from February 2013. This is the effects of sequestration, of killer austerity. I say killer austerity all the time. I say genocidal austerity is what Republicans and Democratic austerity ghouls, Tea Party Republicans and austerity Democrats, that's what they're pushing.
And you know they're promoting the myth that getting sick is your own fault.
What Collins said is that at the beginning of the sequester, that first of all, the National Institutes of Health, his entity, would have to cut $1.6 billion from the budget for fiscal year 2013 under the automatic sequestration cuts. And that is a cut of 5.1% of funds for medical research and other projects. The estimate is that the NIH spends about $6 billion a year, $31 billion over 5 years. But here's the result, and this is what Collins said. In an interview with USA Today, Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, said the United States could lose an entire generation of young scientists if the sequester comes in and people that have fought maybe for years to get grants to begin processes of scientific research, right, with, buying equipment, setting up laboratories, hiring nurses, laboratory assistants, colleagues, and others, right? Mm-hmm. If you then come in and say, sorry, the Tea Party doesn't like you, and we're going to cut you off and let you wither on the vine, mm-hmm. then what are they going to say? They're going to say, well, let's try China. Let's try European Union. Let's try the private sector, right? Let's try somebody who's going to gouge the consumers with, we have a pill which is in the area of $800 a pill. This is obviously outrageous, but if you want to have that, then you can do it this way. So the problem is that our ability through the NIH to promote scientific research and to find cures, this has been significantly damaged by this idiotic, reactionary, redneck orgy of austerity and cuts. And as I say killer cuts because they are killer cuts. The story was the Republicans, whenever the Republicans say regulations, they say job-killing regulations. I say, whenever you're talking budget cuts, be honest, say killer cuts. Mm-hmm. Austerity is genocide. So if you're talking austerity, these are genocidal cuts and killer cuts, and they are, and you can see it. And I wonder, down there in Texas, right, since this is where the thing began, how many people down there are maybe having second thoughts about their willingness to vote for these redneck reactionaries? I have other words for them, but not now. Maybe you're going to die as a result of the fact that there's no cure for Ebola. Right? So I think people have to take that absolutely.
The mismatch in the amount of money we spend, how much money do we give to Wall Street every month to bail them out versus any of these figures you've mentioned?
Now, Nixon, 40 years ago, right, what was it, 1972, Nixon declared a war on cancer, mm-hmm. has some continuing positive results. And I think the fact that certain forms of cancer have been significantly reduced over the past several decades has to do with the fact that Nixon at least declared a war on cancer, which meant that there's a special budget for fighting cancer, which goes directly to the president. It has a special status in the budget. And I think it's hard to correlate specific measures with results. But on the whole, over the past 40 years, cancer has taken quite a few serious defeats, right? And there are a lot of people alive today producing and contributing mm-hmm. or just living, right? That's worthwhile too, that have benefited from that. So I think we would need to have this idea of a crash program.
Yeah.
And and then they'd say, how much do you want to spend on that? You want to spend as much as you can. Mm-hmm. And here's the problem then. If I decide I want to declare war on Ebola, I'm confronted with a finite number of researchers, a finite number of laboratories, and a finite number of projects that I can fund. And the problem there is I might want to spend $5 billion in a year, but maybe there's just no way I can do that given the number of laboratories, the number of doctors. Maybe I can only spend $1 billion or $2 billion in the first year. And then I have to build up. In other words, I've got to create capacity so that I can spend more and get more in terms of results.
But there's a mythology that's descended on this country, both from the left and the right, that the cancer research industry is worse than cancer itself.
I think this is the voice of the ignorant, backward peasant. And this has not changed from Europe in the 1600s. The notion that doctors are bad people and that it's better to avoid medical care. People that are, some people are afraid of dogs, some people are afraid of loud noises, others are afraid of doctors. It is a reactionary, redneck, backward, rural, peasant outlook. And I think the modern civilized outlook is clearly you want to support medicine, you want to support science. Mm-hmm. And what happened to the longevity, the average life expectancy of a human being over the past 100 years. It's more than doubled, hasn't it? Can that be totally unrelated to modern medicine? Sure, water, I'm all for it. Clean water, we need it. But do you think that's got nothing to do with flu shots or smallpox vaccinations or wiping out polio or whatever it is, right? Now, these are human enterprises, so they can always come and say, yeah, but look, there was corruption here, there was malfeasance there. Yes, human affairs are going to turn out to be like that. But on the whole, what would you rather have? Would you rather face the complications that you might get from a flu shot? Or better yet, how about a diphtheria, tetanus, and whooping cough? How about that one? Diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, whooping cough, right? You get that shot, there may be some problems, right? But have you ever seen a child die of tetanus or of whooping cough, or seen a person die of one of these other diseases? You never have. And that's, in a sense, that is what skews the modern outlook. They'd say, well, why should I take these shots? I've never had any problems with these diseases. Yes, right.
Well, it's gone as far that most people believe they're putting cancer viruses in the flu vaccines.
Yeah, well, I don't think most people believe that in a million years.
Okay.
I think that's crazy. The clientele of certain right-wing demagogues of the airwaves, maybe they believe that. And I'll tell you where it comes from. If you look at my book, Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover of America, right, with polygamy, theocracy, and subversion, you'll see that the theory that doctors cause diseases is the theory embraced by that incorrigible enemy of human civilization, Brigham Young, the head of the Mormons, right? The secessionist, the guy who hated Lincoln, hated Grant, hated the United States, a real boiling, bubbling cauldron of hatred and backwardness. You can get that book of mine, and you'll see in there he says, doctors come in, doctors create the diseases, and then doctors create money by pretending to cure the diseases. So if you want to be in the same boat with that, and of course, since that's Utah, right, this entire Mormon area, that's a mass of backwardness which has weighed on the whole history of the United States. But maybe, look, in the couple of minutes we have, maybe a couple of words about what should be done right now, because all the things that I've talked about are relatively long-range things. I would say, first of all, the federal government ought to gear up resources. For example, it's clear the Texas Department of Health doesn't work. How could it work, right? Texas is the state that has the lowest level of insurance of any state in the United States, right? That's the free market, libertarian paradise of Governor Rick Perry. And lo and behold, a large proportion of the people don't have medical care, and therefore you get this, absurd chaos of what went on in Dallas. And it may not be any better anywhere else, but you figure that Texas is going to be one of the most vulnerable points. So I would say the federal government has to realize that their system could be overwhelmed. When you see Fauci and others come on television, they say, as long as we have individuals coming into the United States, we can carry out contact tracing and we can follow all of those cases. And that's fine as long as it's a very limited number of contacts of people coming in. But as soon as that begins to multiply, you will outrun your resources. So at that point, you've got to think about quarantine. And quarantine means you would go and get some nice hotels, right, out in the countryside, and you would say, this is going to be quarantine. And all quarantine ever means is restrictions on the movements and behavior of people. And in Texas, we find the family in question was said, they were told, stay indoors and don't go out. And they said, no, we're not going to do that, right? Well, why do we want to be cooped up? Well, unfortunately, at that point, the interests of the collectivity, yes, of the modern state, have to kick in. You have to say, sorry, we have a nice, we'll take you to the Greenbrier here, or Warm Springs, or whatever it is.
They did this during Boccaccio's Decameron.
In other words, what you need to do is it was done with tuberculosis, right? Your tuberculosis sanitarium. It means that you've got to have a place that is clean, that has tremendously good nutrition, medical services on call, and the people are going to sit there for a week or two, probably at public expense, and sit there, and if they develop the symptoms, then they're sick, and if they don't, they can go home and they can stay in their own rooms, right? So that's sort of the quarantine question. The other question is, what do you do about what's going on in Liberia and Sierra Leone? Now, I would certainly say absolutely get as many of those field hospitals as you can over there, right? If the U.S. can send 30 or 40, start putting the bureaucratic blowtorch on the European Union, right? Get those Eurogars, get those Eurocrats, get them, if the U.S. can send 40, they should send 50 or 60. We're told that Canada is straining to put 2 in there. 2? Come on, Canada, you can put in 10 or 15. What is that? Australia, if Australia can send fighter jets to bomb ISIS, which is fine with me, but how about a few field hospitals, right? Russia, right? Hey, China, show your newfound economic might, right? So get those facilities in there and send in medical professionals. Many of these would be volunteers, right? Some of them religiously motivated, people with a strong sense of charity. Do that. However, I think at this point there is the question of the asymptomatic carriers, right? Healthy carriers, or apparently healthy, coming from the West African area into the United States. And I would not leave that the way it is now. I would say it is not enough to simply take somebody's temperature and ask them to fill out a questionnaire. I would say at this point you would need to take their temperature and give them, what can I call it? I guess for want of a better word, the El Al treatment. In other words, you know what El Al does to you if you want to fly on their planes?
The Israeli airlines? Yeah, they
give you the third degree practically, right? They question you, they catch you in contradictions and God knows what else. So,
I went to Israel for 6 weeks once, and they gave me an hour interrogation in a back room about why I was trying to come.
I'm afraid that's what it would take, right?
Yeah.
Because the problem is you can get on the plane with no fever, but you're infected, and then when you get, as in the case of Texas, that's exactly what happened, right? The guy flew over, then the symptoms appeared, and then he was diagnosed in the U.S., right, after some of this Keystone Cops stuff. So I'm afraid that you would have to, at this point, at the very least, have the temperature checked and then the El Al treatment. And I think quite soon that may not be enough. At a certain point, I understand the British government today, not a model in my book on most things, but I think the British government today said that they will be stopping all direct flights from London to Liberia, Sierra Leone, and back. And I think that may be the trend also for the U.S. I don't see why that should be taboo. You notice that you're dealing with ideology, right? The Republicans are austerity ghouls. They don't want to pay. Democrats are, what can we call it? Politically correct, right? They say, oh, no, we can't do that, especially because it's Africa. Well, I'm afraid you have to deal with the hand that you've been given. So I would say future traffic between the United States and West Africa should be done by military charters, right? The Pentagon, they charter jets all the time, right, to take troops around the world, and or military airlift command. In other words, the U.S. has an air force with airlift capabilities. They can ship stuff over, they can take people over, and that will not involve commercial airliners with all the problems involved with that. And you might want to do that some point down the road. You might want to do it immediately. That's very hard for me to judge, but that should not be a taboo. And I'm afraid if you listen carefully to the reasoning why these public health officials say we should not stop commercial flights, their reasoning is not convincing. Their reasoning doesn't take into account the ability of the military, of the government, to fly over the people and equipment that are absolutely necessary to fight the epidemic over there, right, in the forward defense of the United States. I would absolutely do that, but I would do it with military flights and maybe not with commercial ones.
Why would something like this be considered taboo?
Again, the libertarians, because they're hysterical about government activity, and the politically correct because it's Africa.
Right. Okay.
And there's a prima facie assumption of racism, which can also be correct. I mean, I think oftentimes the assumption of racism is correct. It's realistic. It's grows out of experience. But it won't help anybody if Ebola comes to the United States. That's simply, this is the place ultimately where the main effort of humanity to defeat this is going to have to come from the United States, simply because we have at least the remains of an effective New Deal system. Because you can see what the idea is. It's a question of social surplus, right? You've got to have tremendous resources, logistics in depth. You got to have redundancy. You got to have not one hospital, but 5. You got to have not one isolation room, right, but 20 and more, right? And you got to have the ability to surge that, right, to build them as you need them, and that can mean a great deal, and that can certainly be transported.
Well, we talked about this in the beginning of the show, but the average person is just going to still go back to that. We don't have the money to build it.
What is money? Look,
explain that.
What you're talking about is resources. Do you have trained manpower? As it happens, we do. Most of them are unemployed, but we have people sitting around who can take part in defeating this. We have empty buildings. We have former hospitals. We have all kinds of facilities that could be geared up for these purposes. And we've got the people that we've got about $1.6 billion to $2 billion worth of researchers and laboratories left over from 2013 to 2014 who became unemployed. We could rehire them immediately. Remember,
it seems to me people can't wrap their heads around that. They just say, oh, the budget, it's going to hurt the budget.
But it's off budget. Remember, a central bank can create as much money as it wants. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to put that down the rat hole of speculation? Then you have serious problems. But if you say, I'm going to use this money to move manpower, resources to fight a pandemic and save lives, why, that money is simply your means of shifting resources from one front to another. That's what people don't understand.
It needs to become clear how much we throw down this rat hole. It's not clear to people.
You could easily, you could do it also with a command economy, right? You could have a central state planning authority, commissariat. They could do it too, but the method using the money is actually more efficient, right? Because it means that you don't have to pay attention to so many details, right? You're simply moving resources. And so I would simply say to people, this is philosophical, economical, historical, practical all at once. If you want to live, you've got to take what I'm telling you seriously. You've got to essentially say, I will not vote for a candidate that advocates genocidal austerity and killer cuts. I just won't. As a matter of fact, I'll mobilize to stop them. And naturally, I recommend people in California, in Nebraska, in other states, right? Look at the Tax Wall Street candidates, Tax Wall Street Democrat, Tax Wall Street.
James Hinton for Congress.
James Hinton in Napa and Sonoma, 5th District of California. And, of course, Dan Berdoff, a very fine candidate in Nebraska. You're going to have to write him in on the ballot. But it's worth it. You want to send them a message. You want a protest vote that gives you the most bang for the buck.
Write Dan in.
These guys, and lo and behold, they might even win. Who knows? That you never know.
DanForNebraska.com.
Dan for Nebraska.
Or run yourself.
And get ready to run yourself, yes, because let George do it is not going to work, right? Eventually it's going to come down to, if not now, when? And if not you, who? The old SDS motto from the 60s and 70s. I think get active or get radioactive, right? The other, I guess, would be get active or get Ebola positive.
Okay, we're running out of time. Do you want to wrap up with a couple words, Webster?
It's a brutal and scary situation, right? And this could change very, very rapidly. Again, I don't want to disparage Anthony Fauci and the people who work at the NIH because I value and appreciate what they do. But we also have to factor in these are public officials and they cannot speculate about what might soon happen, right? They can't do that because that might get people very upset and it might cause disorder. But it seems to me the U.S. system is fine in terms of the first line of defense. It's excellent, but it has no depth. And 3.05 hospital beds per 1,000, that is pathetic. That is totally inadequate.
Yeah.
In a world where Japan is up there with 13 plus, Russia 9 plus, Germany 8 plus, it's not enough. So I think we have to
listen with a jaundiced ear when you hear all these radio host saying that a quarantine facility is really a FEMA death camp to put you in that you need to shoot your way out of.
Of course, there's no money to be made with a reasoned argument recommending competent policies, right? The way you make money in this fallen world of ours is you get out there and shoot your mouth off and spread panic if you can. And of course, it's always it's a FEMA death camp. And by the way, buy some product from my sponsor. Here's a word from my sponsor to sell you something. Right?
The anti-Ebola water filter,
anti-Ebola filters, or whatever they have. Right. Mm-hmm. This is where the most brutal realities of politics kick in. And the main political issues are always life or death. You want to die in a nuclear war? You want to die in a pandemic? Those are the big questions. And that is where you see the vanity of things like campaign finance reform or other process reforms, or what we've just seen in Scotland, right? The ultimate process reform, I guess, is secession, right? The idea that you'd be, instead of having English, Welsh, and Scottish oligarchs and bankers run Scotland, it should be only Scottish oligarchs and bankers should run Scotland. And I'm very glad that they had the sense to say, no, that doesn't solve anything. So there's an element of good sense. Maybe it shows that humanity is not lost, that people might not be so stupid that they can't survive in the world. But there really is a question. Is the human race as presently constituted so stupid that it can't survive? That's an open question. I invite you to answer that we can survive by throwing off the cloak of stupidity at every turn.
Well, we'll help in our small way. We're out of time for tonight. Thank you so much again for Webster for joining us. You've been listening to UCY.tv. Yeah, I'm taking my vitamins. You've been listening to UCY.tv United Front Radio. Have a blessed evening.